Greetings, I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I serve as the interim pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church, New Franklin, Minerva, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Thank you for joining me today. We are on episode 7 of a Bible study of the Gospel according to Luke. If you've come across this video randomly while surfing the web, welcome. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, I invite you to go to my YouTube channel and watch those, and any episodes that are available that might have come after this one. There's also some other studies that I've put on that website, so please join me. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad that God has sent you into our presence. Before we go any further, I would encourage you to have a Bible. You can have a printed Bible, or you can look one up on your phone, tablet, or computer. It's just nice to be able to follow along. I don't have a preference for what translation you use. Whatever works for you is fine. It's just nice to have that text in front of you. I personally use the New Revised Standard Version, but again, any translation is a nice option. I encourage you to have a notebook and a pen and a pencil to write down some notes, to add any thoughts or questions, and as we come to the end or even in the middle of the video, you can pause, leave me a note or a comment. I'd love to hear from you at the very end of the video. My contact information will be available, and you're welcome to reach me through any of those as well. Today's episode, we are concluding the infancy narratives. The infancy narratives as a whole are verses Chapter 1, verse 5, through chapter 2, verse 52. And today we're focusing on the last story in that section, and it's Jesus as a boy in the temple. And that's chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Before we get into that, though, I just wanted to review our homework from episode 6. Episode 6, we reviewed We reviewed chapter 2, verses 21 through 40, as this was Jesus' naming and presentation in the temple. I invited you to read those verses each day throughout the week, and I wanted you to reflect on what you heard. So what was it in Simon's words that bring you hope? Was there something in Simon's prophecy that brought concerns? And are there any questions that have come up so far that you hope Luke will answer? So those are our homework questions for episode 6. I hope you've had time to reflect and review them. As always, I like to review the themes that will be running throughout the Gospel of Luke, and I'm posting a slide so you can read along as I present them now. So some of the themes we'll see are 1, God's redemptive purposes. 2, salvation for all alike. 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. 4, table fellowship. 5, the role of a disciple. And 6, the importance of an accurate witness. I want you to keep those themes in mind as we go through this study each episode, so that you can say, okay, what is Luke pulling out of here? What are the theme or themes that we're hearing? So if you haven't opened your Bible yet, I invite you to do that to the book of Luke, chapter 2, starting at verse 41. I'm going to read these verses together, then I'm going to give a little background, and then we'll kind of take them in smaller segments. Now every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. When they started to look for him among their relatives and friends, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." Jesus said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years, and in divine and human favor. So a little bit of background before we jump in too deeply. Just a reminder, we mentioned this last week's episode, but I wanted to lift it up again, is the temple in Jerusalem. So this is a particular place. This is not the synagogue in each community, but this is the temple, capital T, in Jerusalem. And it is the holiest place of worship in the Jewish tradition. It is also the only place where sacrifices can be made to fulfill the law. And from what we've seen in episode 6, Mary and Joseph had already been to the temple with Jesus to complete the purity rituals after he was born. So now we hear them in this story as they're back in the temple for the feast of the Passover. And as it says, this is something they did every year, so this is clearly part of their family's faith tradition. For those of you who don't know the Passover story, I'm going to summarize a very long story for you. But the Passover celebration is the culmination of a remembrance of the Israelites' release from slavery in Egypt. The story is found in Exodus chapter 6, verse 28, through chapter 10, verse 50. As I said, I'm summarizing. Moses was sent to the Pharaoh to seek the Israelites' release from slavery, and when the Pharaoh refused, there was a series of 10 plagues that were sent upon the Egyptians that were an attempt to get Pharaoh to comply. The final plague was the death of the firstborn son of each household, and that included animals. The Israelites were given instructions on how to designate their houses so the plague would not strike them. So this is a familiar and yearly commemoration among our Jewish brothers and sisters, and it's still part of their tradition today. It's part of this time of remembrance of what God has done for them. So Mary, Jesus, and Joseph go as pilgrims to Jerusalem to celebrate this holy and high feast. Now, something to note, Luke is the only gospel writer that includes a story about Jesus' childhood. Now, there is a non-biblical text called the Infancy Narratives of Thomas, and that has other childhood stories of Jesus, but it was not included in what is the traditional Christian canon of the scriptures. So there is a similar story to this in Thomas's gospel, but it's still not quite the same. Thomas's gospel has a very different emphasis in this story. That has an emphasis of this story than what we have in Luke. But one of the things to point out, Luke is not actually doing anything radical in the sense that other ancient biographies often included a story about the hero or a philosopher who had great wisdom as a child. So his actions and his including a similar story would not have been uncommon to other readers, to other hearers of that day. But this story also serves as a transitional story. This story shows a transition from Jesus as an infant to Jesus as an older child, but not yet an adult. But he's starting to get an awareness of his identity, and it actually foreshadows his relationship to God, the Divine Father, his relationship to the teachers of Israel, and also his relationship to the temple. So we'll see those things coming back later. So Luke chapter 2 verse 40 records that as a child, Jesus was filled with wisdom. So it would not be out of place in this story to have an illustration of just what that wisdom looked like while he was still a child. Jesus being in the temple at age 12 and sitting with the teachers, though, is definitely a point that would be out of the norm. It reflects the wisdom that Jesus has, but the story itself reflects Jesus' divine sonship. So this isn't a knock against Mary or Joseph, but again, that movement of Jesus is recognizing his place, his purpose, and this story starts to move us all in that direction. And one unique thing to notice in this story is this is the first time in Luke's gospel that we hear words from Jesus. So again, we're already well into the second chapter, and we're just now hearing Jesus speaking. So let's go through and walk these verses. So Luke, as we know, loves to mark stories, right? To give them a time and a place. And again, we see in these verses that Jesus is moving, right? Jesus is traveling. Jesus is traveling with his parents. And actually in verse 51, we also have Jesus traveling. It's not uncommon for Luke to use this as a marker from one story to another, some travel narrative to indicate that this teaching point is ending and a new teaching point is beginning. So keep that in mind when you hear about Jesus traveling from one place to another. We note quite clearly in verse 41 that this was an annual journey for them to go to Jerusalem for the Passover. And this again reinforces that Joseph and Mary were faithful and devout practitioners and followers of the Jewish law. So they were very faithful people. And to give you some idea of what this journey might mean, to walk from Nazareth to Jerusalem would take 4 to 5 days if you're going about 15 miles a day. So this is not something that someone takes lightly. This is not a walk up to the corner store. This is a journey, and it's an investment. It's an investment in time. It's an investment in resources. So this would be a pretty significant and expensive pilgrimage each year. Now, one of the things I want to point out in verse 42 is that it clearly states Jesus was 12 years old. And I think this is an important thing to note because in Jewish custom, it's not adulthood for male children until they're 13. So this clearly indicates that Jesus was still a child. And the fact that he was still a child, though getting close, obviously, to that adulthood, he works against his parents' desires and plans and ideas. Now, verses 41 and 42, as I said, kind of mention where Jesus is. It places him in its physical location, reminding us again that Luke loves to tell us where Jesus is or where the story is taking place. In verse 43, we hear that the festival was ended and it was time for them to return home, but Jesus chose to stay in Jerusalem. And of course, his parents didn't know. This is an interesting and complicated thing, right? As a parent myself, we want to know where our kids are. But what also you need to be aware of is this is not, us taking our kid to the grocery store and losing them 2 aisles over. There would be lots of other people making this same pilgrimage, coming for the same purpose. And it's not likely that Mary and Joseph and Jesus made this journey by themselves. It was probably made with a family group or a group from their village. So it would be quite easy to think that your child was with someone else. One of the things that my family does is we take a family trip down to the beach each summer. And one of the biggest things we're always really aware of, especially when our kids were all very young, was who has eyes on the kid. So if the kid was up on the blanket and they wanted to go down to the water's edge, we would do hand signals, or you need to go down and touch, your aunt or your uncle or your dad or your mom, so they know you're down there, and we watch them go, right? You guys have probably done that in those family events as well. Well, in the midst of a crazy crowd, Jesus chose to stay behind, and quite innocently, and I don't blame Mary and Joseph at all, they start their journey thinking Jesus is with their family group or their traveling companions, and then finally realize he's not with them. They had gone a whole day's journey, and they realized Jesus wasn't there. And then they start to search, and they look amongst their group of travelers, and when they realize he wasn't there, they return to Jerusalem, and they find him in the temple. Now we're in verses 44 through 46. And in verse 46 it says, after 3 days they found him in the temple. Now we don't know exactly why Luke specifies 3 days. I mean, there's some belief that this is a reference to, his death and resurrection. But Luke doesn't use 3 days as some sort of repetitive marker or anything else. This is actually the only time he uses this reference. So we're not sure exactly if 3 days is something we should have a lot of focus on or not. Because it could be, so it was 3 days of traveling, or 3 days, they looked for him for 3 days in Jerusalem. We're not quite sure. So I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time and energy on that 3-day thing, just remembering that it gives some sign that they had to look for a while, that he wasn't easy to find, but maybe it's because they weren't expecting him to be in the temple. Honestly, if your kid went missing because you had gone on a trip, where would you least expect them to be? Now, my family might actually look for me in a library, but maybe for other kids that would be the last place you would look for them. So they found him in the temple. And when they found him there, he wasn't there playing. He was actually sitting with the teachers and asking questions, having conversation, learning, and studying with them. And it says in here that all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and answers. And I think this is an important part to remember, because it goes back again to verse 40. The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. This young child had a wisdom beyond his years. So the teachers in the temple were amazed, and all who were around there, those who were listening in to these study sessions, were amazed at his ability to ask questions, to answer, to respond, to understand. It's an inkling of just the level of wisdom that God placed in Jesus. Now, some people read this text and think that Jesus was teaching the teachers, but that's really not what this really is about. Jesus wasn't there to show up the teachers, but instead it sounded like he really was exploring what it meant and who he was and how he lived into that reality. And as we look at that, we start to come to the climax of this story, which is in verse 48 and 49. This is the interaction between Mary and Jesus when Mary and Joseph find him. So when his parents saw him, they were astonished. Again, it doesn't seem to be uncommon that Mary and Joseph were astonished, especially about what people were saying about the child. But Mary responds to him like a very typical parent. "Why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you with great anxiety." I don't know a single parent who's ever had their child disappear in a store who doesn't have this exact same response. What were you doing? Why did you wander off? We were worried about you. Mary and Joseph, very much caring and loving parents. But the key to this whole story is how Jesus responds to them. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" This isn't callousness on Jesus' part, but Jesus saying, "I know what I'm about. You haven't caught on yet? You didn't need to search for me. Where else would you look? I'm here, doing what my Father calls me to do." And one of the translations for my Father's house could also be saying my Father's business. I'm about my Father's business. I'm about doing what God has called me to do. Jesus is starting to understand who he is and his role and his place. And his parents are still not quite understanding. It says they did not understand what he said to them. Mary and Joseph, again and again, are introduced to amazing things, who see and hear promises from Samuel, from Aunt Anna, hear these stories from the shepherds, and they hold these things that are going on in their hearts. They're pondering them, right? Mary ponders them, holds them in her heart. But they're still not quite there yet. They're still not quite ready. But I think the other part for us to focus on is the "I must be." This divine mandate, this statement that shows Jesus' awareness of God's purpose and his role to fulfill. And we will see in other parts of Luke, Jesus says, "I must. I must." This isn't a question. This isn't even really a sense of choice, but I must do what God is calling me to do. I must be who God is calling me to be. He is to fulfill his destiny. How often do we feel like we must be about something because it is God's plan for us? But for Jesus, what we see here is just the start of the understanding of his identity as the Son of God. I must be about my Father's business. I must be in my Father's house. The transition is starting in Luke. From the promises about who John is, who John will become, who Jesus will become, are just starting to take place in this story here. This is who Jesus is. He is the one who is listening and asking questions, exploring God's plan, and being with God's people. Verse 51 and 52 are the next transition point. And I think it's important to see how Luke closes this scene. Jesus then went with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. So clearly we see this scene ending, but we realize that this isn't really the part where Jesus begins his public ministry. He returned home with Mary and Joseph, his parents, and he is obedient to them. He honors the commandment of love. He respects the commandment of honoring one's father and one's mother. This scene is not a rebellion against his parents. This scene is just a transition, the starting of Jesus' awareness of who he is and how he is to be in the world. But it wasn't yet time for him and his public ministry. The conclusion that he continues to increase in wisdom and in years, in divine and human favor, echo what was just finished after his presentation in the temple. He continues to grow in wisdom. He finds favor in God and in humanity. This is the conclusion of what's called the infancy narratives. Now, clearly at 12, Jesus is no longer an infant. He is an older child, but not yet an adult. But I always wonder and think about Mary and Joseph's reaction to what Jesus said. They didn't have this insight into Jesus' mind and his understanding, his self-understanding as the Son of God. And though his birth was miraculous, it still didn't seem to prepare his parents for his ministry. Mary is depicted in Luke as consistently responsive to the revelation brought through experience in her life. And she treasures these experiences. And eventually, they bring insight later and provide a firm foundation for an obedient life as a disciple. We don't always understand what God is about. But yet, if we hold on to the actions of God around us, and we ponder them, and we see them as places where God is at work, then we too get to be experiencing and growing in faith. Our discipleship is not based on having it all together, of having all the answers, but instead of taking those divine moments that are presented before us to hear the story of Christ in the pieces and parts of Scripture and bring them together and recognize the nature of God's work in the world to bring salvation and restoration. One of the gifts that I like about Luke's gospel is that the people who hear Christ, the people who are experiencing this divine story, don't always understand what's going on in the moment. But yet the gathering of the story and the living of the life brings about the change, the understanding, the depth, and the faith. Mary is imperfect. Joseph is imperfect. But yet they continue to faithfully care for this child that God has blessed them with. And eventually they understand and see the development of this child into the one that we call the Messiah. Our discipleship often feels the same. It's a journey. It's a step-by-step process where we learn a little more, and we learn just a little bit more. And as it comes together, we can say, this is how God works. This is who God is. And this is who God calls me to be in response to God's grace and love. As we think back over the story of Jesus in the temple, I want us to again return to those themes. What themes did you hear? Did you hear the theme of God's redemptive purposes? I don't know if that one's a really clear one. It definitely talks about who Christ is and Christ's coming to understanding that he is to be about God's work. How about the theme of salvation for all alike? That's clearly not stated in this one. How about the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth? We still haven't quite heard that theme played out in this passage. Nor the theme of table fellowship. But what about the role of a disciple? I think Jesus models that a little bit. I have to be about my Father's business, but also the role of discipleship that's revealed in his parents. To faithfully serve God, to be those who are present. And then the sixth is the importance of an accurate witness. That one, again, isn't really strongly represented here. This story about Jesus in the temple is really anchored in the fact that Jesus is coming to his own self-understanding. And it marks a transition. Your homework for this week is to think about traditions, whether family or religious traditions, that mark time for you or help you to remember what God has done. I ask that question because Passover is one of the Jewish traditions that mark time and honor the work of God for them. So what are the traditions that you have that mark time for you and help you remember what God has done? One of the other things that I find intriguing, and for myself as I explore this story, is, was Jesus so enthralled by this ability to dialogue and learn that he really lost sense of time and place and family? Have you ever been learning or doing something and were so enthralled by it that you lost track of time and those around you? Maybe you were a kid. Maybe it's something you do now. But what was it? What was that thing that caught you so completely and fully that you lost track of time? It could be a craft like woodworking or sewing or knitting. It could be gardening. It could be a walk in the woods. It could be a great book. But you are so enthralled that you lost track of where you should be. I think kids do that quite easily. And so when I think about Jesus in the temple, it's maybe not what you would think a kid would be enthralled with. I would always think, kids get sucked into, watching that caterpillar crawl across a leaf. And so they lose track of you while you keep walking and they stay behind. Or the story that's my favorite is my daughter and I both love to touch clothes as we go through because we love texture. And sometimes we'll go by and something will catch her eye and she'll get lost in that moment, in the visual or in the textural feel of something, and she loses track of where I am. So what gets you so enthralled that you lose track of time and those around you? And finally, Jesus starts to come into his understanding about what his work is, how he is supposed to be in the world. And has God ever called you to do something that few, if anyone else, understood why you were doing it? You know, Jesus' response to Mary and Joseph was, well, where else would I have been? Well, what have you been called to do? That when people say, why are you doing that? You can be like, because it's God's work. I'm going about what God wants me to do, right? I'm going about God's business. And they may not understand why you're about it, but you know that it's what God is calling you to do. We're going to close our study time here. In our next episode, we will begin the section on the preparation for the ministry of Jesus, which is chapter 3, verse 1, through chapter 4, verse 13. And we're going to focus on the proclamation of John the Baptist, which is chapter 3, verses 1 through 20. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been my pleasure to explore this scripture with you. As I've said before, if you have any questions or reflections, comments, you're welcome to post them in the comments section on this page, but you're also welcome to reach out to me via email or my social media contacts, which are listed at the end of this video. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.